an unfolding economic crisis, a climate crisis, and growing instability in the social climate, with polarization and fracturing in democratic structures. It is becoming clearer that all these crises are interwoven and stem from common causes, but that is not my is not my focus here. And to the fearful list of current crises, I would add an anxiety crisis. Many people are, not surprisingly, experiencing heightened survival anxiety these days, and I will argue they are trying to manage it by hovering between experiencing too much anxiety and too little anxiety. Neither response helps people stay with the facts, which is vital for any effective survival strategy. An example of too little anxiety is someone who said to me, "What a relief that nature and climate have been recovering since the coronavirus." While this belief may have brought him relief, it is a false belief. The facts are that global heating is accelerating, the permafrost has started to melt, releasing methane, a highly dangerous greenhouse gas, and carbon emissions from fires burning in the Arctic this year dwarf any savings made. Hearing this news threatens to overwhelm with too much anxiety, and this can trigger rapidly switching to another subject to try to protect inner equilibrium and to bring psychic relief. The too little anxiety response is highly maladaptive, as anxiety is a vital alarm call, a necessary prod that fast remedial action is needed. The too much anxiety response potentially has different and complex strands. It may be a realistic response to the degree of environmental devastation that has already occurred. Seeing that can indeed feel overwhelming, and people need to protect themselves from being overwhelmed. However, "It's too much, best think about something else" can also be part of maintaining too little concern. My point is that climate change is hard to think about, and to explore why this is so, I will begin with the idea of bubbles. A bubble is a largely socially constructed way of seeing the world. The bubble functions to minimize any moral unease, anxiety, rage, and grief that people would feel if they were to see the real world clearly. The world as seen from inside the bubble is a virtual, as if, fake world. In the bubble, unsustainable behavior that causes alarm and suffering is thought of as normal and usual, indeed the only way. In the bubble, people can cheerfully consume and fly about on holiday without counting the true cost. Crucially, the bubble preserves the group's sense of moral rightness, and the group may react to any challenge with outrage and counterattack. The mechanisms that preserve bubbles are largely maintained by group pressure, and people in the bubble are largely not conscious that these mechanisms are operating. Bubbles are seeded, inflated, and then maintained largely through culture, the sort of culture I have called the culture of uncare, meaning a culture whose perverse aim is actively to regress people psychologically, to boost their infantile omnipotence, and to cause them to disassociate, meaning to distance themselves from the part of them that cares and wants to be socially responsible in life. Beyond thought, such a culture promotes spiritual drift and leaves people psychiatrically disinherited, Those are his terms. My latest book argues that neoliberalism's culture of uncare, which includes advertising, media, political propaganda, and social group pressure, works ceaselessly to undermine care and social responsibility. It is designed to make ignoring others and future generations seem unproblematic. And my argument in the book is that this suits the needs of the neoliberal economy. Now, people in power who foment bubbles for profit work hard to get ordinary people to collude, and they work hard to try to ensure it will be others, not they, who suffer, especially when the bubble bursts. The financial bubble that burst in 2008 saw bankers profit, while 6 million Americans lost their homes, and austerity measures hit people hard right across the world. The ramifications of austerity measures that were applied continue to the present day, and COVID-19 has made them much more visible. These ramifications. Turning to climate, oil executives and the political establishment knew in the 1980s that burning fossil fuels leads to global warming. They knew it full well. They also knew that to continue burning fossil fuels, they must seed and grow a climate bubble. They did so by putting in place a culture of uncare that would encourage people to minimize their conscious awareness that burning fossil fuels leads to global warming. The climate bubble is far larger, far more damaging, and far more consequential than any bubble so far in human history. It has involved planning to extract all for now, with storms and instability left for those who come after. The climate bubble has served a particular sanitizing psychological function, which is bleaching the violence, the death, and the suffering from the picture. This bubble is now bursting. It must, as all bubbles must do eventually, because they are based on omnipotent thinking. The damage and the suffering are now too huge to conceal. One sign of the climate bubble bursting is that more people are openly talking about the state of the climate. Hannah Siegel argued that staying silent is the real crime, and I would add that silence keeps the bubble afloat long enough for the resulting damage to be staggering. Now that the climate bubble is bursting, very broadly speaking, people are responding in two main ways. On the one hand, trying to preserve bubble thinking with flight-fight responses. On the other hand, struggling to face reality. And of course, also veering between these two. I will look further into both these sorts of ways. First, flight and fight. I call this Noah's Arkism. The very wealthy are buying luxury bunkers, both individual bunkers and bunkers in large compounds such as one in Slovakia and one in the hills of South Dakota. They are designed to withstand what is euphemistically being called the event. The event includes global warming, nuclear fallout, poisonous air, viruses, and attacks from protesters viewed as hostile. All these threats are to be kept out and fought off. Who knew that it would be a virus that would hit early and so hard? Although I must add that climate change is also hitting very hard already. The tech expert Douglas Rushkoff described meeting hedge fund managers who had asked him how they could keep safe in their bunkers. Questions included how to defend themselves against their own security guards. Staying in the bunker requires not only practical measures, but a bolt-hole mentality that involves obliterating one's awareness of any vulnerability and dependence on others for survival and sustenance. Also, obliterating awareness of one's own fragility and one's compassion for those bearing the brunt. This thinking is one response to the coronavirus. We will isolate and be saved. Security will be beefed up with technology and surveillance. Those on the outside will be sacrificed. We will justify that by assigning their lives less value and respect. Right now, the classism and racism fueling this way of seeing is under the spotlight and being challenged worldwide. The general fantasy system at work here is based on the idea that we are in the privileged group to be saved. Why? Because we're special, entitled, and worth it. It is the others who will be sacrificed. This is Noah's Archism, commonly found with bubbles, but in relation to the climate crisis, more radically out of touch with reality. And this is because the climate crisis will affect everyone. Those choosing extractive, oil-based business as usual must employ ever stronger psychic defenses to keep reality out, particularly as their own children are to be sacrificed. The Ark is a highly weaponized psychic retreat from reality in which moral purity is maintained through meaning reversals and projection of the bad. Also emerging is fetishizing apocalyptic, nihilistic accounts of the future. Truth tellers are being admonished for causing needless worry. Indeed, they are now starting to be called eco-terrorists spreading terror. And doom narratives are proliferating. They make taking what is simultaneously a suicidal and a murderous path potentially seem positively exciting, even to be relished, talking about these apocalyptic narratives. Psychologically, we might ask, is all this a perverse way of people trying to cope with what is fast becoming too much to bear? While the very wealthy have literal bunkers, the rest are left to find spurious safety in imaginary bunkers. Those with some money may harbour the illusion that money will see them through. The poor may collude with strongman leaders who promise them passage onto various arcs, including the UK Brexit Island Arc, the American Wall Arc, the European Wire Fence Arc, and the Brazilian Macho Arc. The price here is loyalty to the strong leader and weaponizing oneself against the sane, reality-seeking, compassionate part of the mind. The rest of what I say is addressed to those of us who are trying to cope with the shock of emerging from the climate bubble and trying to stay sane. The problem is that by the time this bubble burst, so much damage to our life support systems had already been done, and some of it is irreparable. A friend and climate colleague said to me the other day, at times reality often feels unbearable, and I agreed. She went on, but I have to try and bear it, or I will lose my sanity. I agreed. So, how do we face climate reality, work it through, and keep reasonably sane? And of course, working through is an ongoing process. Just have some water. I believe we first need to appreciate that we face not one or a few, but a whole series of shocks. The first being that climate news is itself shocking. Global warming has largely happened during the last 40-odd years, the very years that span the neoliberal era. Global warming is neoliberals' legacy, and that is shocking. But more shocking is that warming has started very recently to speed up rapidly. As I said earlier, the problem with climate reality is we tend to feel either too much or too little about it, veering between shock and disavowal, where you minimize reality, and neither state helps us think rationally, by which I mean thinking that contains and works through our feelings and bodily reactions. In addition to shock at the news itself, people are likely to feel assaulted by feelings that being in the bubble protected them from. Shame can suddenly be particularly acute, because in the bubble, the shame is spread and held by the group. When I heard about the vast numbers of animals who died in the Australian bushfires, I felt ashamed to be a member of my own species. Some feelings released will be melancholic and potentially paralyzing. Others, while very painful, are lively and part of grieving. Neoliberalism's culture of uncare's aim, this is my argument, and I elaborate in the book, is to prevent people from seeing the damage and the harm that neoliberalism's purely extractive model and way of seeing causes, and to nip any grief about it in the bud. I mean, psychologically, it aims to keep people at the stage of blaming and denial and not moving on towards grieving and accepting reality. That's my argument. A further shock is realizing more clearly that most leaders currently in power are continuing with policies leading to ecocide. This means that, in effect, they do not care if people and animals live or die. But I'm stressing the people here because it's more personal. Surely our leaders cannot be that collectively crazy. This is very hard to bear. Then there is the collapse of our own omnipotence, and that can cause further shock. We have radically to reevaluate our sense of ourselves. We see we're vulnerable and unprotected when we thought we were more invincible. Death suddenly feels closer and more real. We see how easily seducible we are, how prey to colluding with corrupt forces. We feel shocked to see that we were duped and that we allowed ourselves to be duped. On the other hand, it's also deeply replenishing to emerge from a collective psychic retreat from reality and see the real picture more clearly. It puts us in touch with our lively entitlement to conditions that support life and that make life sustainable. We realize we have steadily been losing these conditions through a process of slow violence. Only with the true picture can we make genuine repairs where we can. So stepping out of the bubble enables us to see strength and beauty in the interconnected systems that support life, and also see the fragility in those systems and the imperative for us to respect their limits in the way that we live our lives. I now want to turn to likely feelings as we emerge from the climate bubble, because I think there are many different kinds of feelings. So with this background, my question is, how do we work through the tragedy unfolding and stay sane? I think we need to find the answers together. For my part, these days, I read as much environmental news as possible, but never, ever before writing or sleeping, as it's too disturbing and it makes me anxious. And I'm not alone. Many people are reporting eco-anxiety, which, unless it is crippling, is on the side of life. It is care's alarm call to face reality and to act. My caution is that eco-anxiety is also currently often being applied unhelpfully as a label, a catch-all that covers all sorts of feelings about the climate crisis, each of which deserves exploration. So, for instance, we may feel traumatized by climate news. Trauma can overwhelm the capacity to think clearly, leaving people struggling with feeling both over and underwhelmed by traumatizing events. They can find it harder to judge whom is to blame with any sense of proportion, and they are prone to dissociate from the traumatizing event. Here we have the potential for a human tipping point. What I mean is neoliberalism's culture of uncare perversely promotes disassociation, which leads to a pile-up of damage. The damage then becomes so severe that it's traumatizing to see it, leading to further disassociation. A destructive cycle of increasing disassociation can then gather momentum. I bring in this perspective not to spread gloom, but to alert us to potential forces operating within us as well as in others, so that we can understand them and recognize them better if and when they take hold. I've found studying war trauma in soldiers very helpful when thinking about potential climate trauma. First of all, there is post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, when one's sense of safety has been traumatically shattered and one may constantly relive the trauma in the present, feeling danger may strike again at any moment. This is called hyperarousal. Many PTSD sufferers eventually convert hyperarousal into hyperconstriction, where all emotions, even pleasure, are toned down and experiences are avoided that might evoke feelings of threat. So my question to myself is my restricting climate news to certain times of the day hyperconstriction? To what extent are many of us hypervigilantly on the lookout for climate knowledge and using hyperconstriction to shut it out? This could be a healthy response, a way to protect our hearts and minds from overwhelm. Then there's pre-traumatic stress disorder. That's trauma that soldiers suffer in prolonged situations of helpless anticipation of a future traumatizing event. The psychiatrist Lisa van Susteren sees our stress at anticipating impending climate breakdown as a form of pre-traumatic stress disorder. Climate breakdown does feel close now. Each of us will have our own fearful scenarios, also, importantly, potentially shaped by trauma's tendency to reignite earlier traumas. Jen Bendel has painted vivid pictures of climate breakdown to help cut through what he calls collapse denial. Of course, another form of collapse denial is to forget that people right now across the world and climate refugees are experiencing just these conditions, now greatly exacerbated by COVID-19. When a journalist asked me, how do we tell people about the climate emergency without traumatizing them? I replied, it's not easy to know how. But I firmly believe what matters is whether we give truthful pictures about the future in a caring way, not in a careless, switched off way that does not relate to how they might be feeling. For instance, I heard a child say, school told us today that the world is about to end. Is that true? Her parent answered, of course it's not true, and then immediately changed the subject. I suggest that bald answer, while technically true, abandoned the child and delegitimized that child's voice and concern. Now, rage is another response to the crisis and the series of crises we're in. Rage can be healthy, but it can also be part of a trauma reaction, in which case it is more likely to be loveless and tending towards hate acts, repetitive destructive grievance, and identifying with the traumatizers, which is why we need to pay close attention to whether we're feeling traumatized. I now want to turn to moral injury, which is another form of climate and ecological trauma. Moral injury is the violation of our sense of what's right. Studying stories of morally injured soldiers reveals this pattern, a sense of betrayal by a leadership that idealized the view and hid the truth, that devalued life and that lied. The helplessness of feeling caught up in a vast machine that prevents one from acting with care and conscience. The collapse of one's inner ideals, feeling one's own experience and sense of reality is brushed aside and does not count. Now, this could be a description of what many people now report feeling about the economic and political world in which they live. The global economy now structures how people live in ways that conflict with their ordinary human decency. Daily life, especially in the more affluent global north, is fraught with moral dilemmas. Do I take the car, the bus, or the bike? Do I eat that chicken, knowing it likely spent a miserable life? Do I buy that book online from a company that employs people on 0-hour contracts? What do I do when nearly everything I see in the supermarket comes in plastic? My very way of living causes damage. And how do I live with the guilt and shame of my participation? Suffering moral injury is a sign of mental health, not disorder, because it means that one's conscience is alive. Fred Alfred noted that moral injury occurs when command is casual about killing. Many people now see how casual our current political leadership is about our lives, our children's lives, and life itself. COVID-19, exposing cruel disparities between different groups of people, and in some cases casualness about numbers of deaths, can only lead to increased trauma of experiencing moral injury. Part of moral recovery is realizing that faith in leadership has been misplaced and demanding good enough leaders. Staunching and repairing moral injury involves psychic work, facing remorse, seeking forgiveness, gaining new understanding of one's individual culpability, and being able to place that in a wider context. It is in these ways that shattered ideals can be rebuilt and a sense of what's right be refound amid the scars. Judith Herman, who studied survivors of trauma, argued that social action served as the strongest antidote to traumatic experience. It created, quote, an alliance with others based on cooperation and shared purpose, and gave, quote, protection against terror and despair. One example is the American Army veteran Wesley Clark Jr., who led a ceremony at Standing Rock in which Army vets asked Native Americans for forgiveness. Quote, "We didn't respect you. We polluted your earth. We've hurt you in so many ways, but we've come to say that we're sorry. We are at your service and we beg for your forgiveness." I believe breaking with the current culture of uncare requires a collective effort of working through grief, remorse, and a reshouldering of responsibility. And it matters greatly that this is undertaken in a spirit of forgiveness of self and other. The real tragedy with the climate bubble is that it allowed so much damage to accrue that facing climate reality now can feel unbearable. What I do know from my own experience is that trying to bear it and allowing myself to feel at times overwhelmed helps me better contain my own distress and soften my own rage. I find I am more reflective and sadder, knowing I too profited from ignoring nature's limits and colluded with the culture that worked to uncare me and us. Perhaps we need a new position, the tragic position, alongside the depressive position. We need to find ways collectively to work the tragic position through. Could we see the video now, please, Chris?
Yeah, okay. 2 seconds,
Thank
I'll
you.
get it up. Hang on.
I'm going to, Chris is going to be showing us a video of, can I just give the introduction, of a poet who won one of the prizes at a competition organised by the Poetry Society in conjunction with the Freud Museum, who held a conference on the climate emergency, and the young poets were invited to describe write poetry about their feelings about the climate crisis. And her poem is called, well, you'll see. Sorry,
Okay.
yes, if you could play the video,
Yep.
that would be great.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Mia Nelson, and I'm a sophomore at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire studying English and biology, and I currently work for the Dartmouth Sustainability Office as a digital
Chris,
media.
could you start it again and unmute?
Okay. Apollo. Okay. There we go. So, can you hear me now?
We can now, yes.
Okay, apologies.
Hello, my name is Mia Nelson, and I'm a sophomore at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire studying English and biology, and I currently work for the Dartmouth Sustainability Office as a digital media and storytelling intern. And I will be presenting my poem, You Call It Eco-Trauma. You call it eco-trauma. Wendell Berry called it the peace of wild things, but the milk boy called it the curdled edges of his skating pond, and the priest in his red house called it this too shall pass. And the black geese called it a generational flailing, and my lover called it a summer storm. But really, it was the ending of things that we saw no ending to. Our feet standing on the sweet glacial edge of heaven, wishing we had held the redwood bark closer to our nose, so we might still smell it, as if we could properly name our longing by just having paid more attention, so we could list what we've killed like this. 1. Lake Michigan in the summer, fat blackberries on the surface. 2. The sun on white rocks in New Hampshire, far above tree line. 3. A western Chinese lake lapping at the edge of our yurt. 4. The night in Arizona we ran through cactuses, howling like guava-bellied wolves. 5. Licking rose jam from our fingers, stories about blooming season in September. 6. Gray spires in El Chalten, small mountain town filled with the butter smell of before dawn bakeries. I call it waking up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat and knowing your mother is being killed in the next room but not being able to move. I call it pulling a gun on the mirror or crying every birthday since I was 10, knowing nothing can save me, us, it, ours from time. I call it the heart sickness, and I watch my little brother pick the bones of some tender thing's baby with relish, suck, lick, throw in the bone bowl with the rest. It's funny. The only thing that can really save me is the walk up to Lafayette Mountain, the one that is dark soil and waterfalls and sun suddenly, the moment you can see everything around you, when it finally becomes obvious, nothing this still and clear and God-bred could ever belong to anyone who speaks our greedy language of want. Thank you so much. Hello, my name is...
You know, I just want to depart from what I've written down, because in watching it this time, what I find actually very moving and remarkable is the way, it was wonderful, is the way that she, in facing this huge loss and all the feelings that go with it, she's absolutely in touch with her love of the natural world and of what's being lost. I think, you know, she's not at all cut off from that. She's absolutely in touch with it. But to continue, I want to highlight the lines. I call it waking up in the night, I call it waking up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat and knowing your mother is being killed in the next room, but not being able to move. As these words speak to me of one young person, Mia Nelson, struggling with the tragic position. How do we work through and bear irreparable damage when we fear we have killed the good object that we need to help us with working through. We might see the good object as our Earth Mother being killed by ecocide. I want to suggest it might also refer to another sort of damaged good object, that the culture of uncare has caused such dissociation that we can no longer hear children's cries, even when they are our own children. We do hear the cries, and we are moved, but are we moved to the point where we are prepared to give up any of the privilege and make sacrifices for the next generation? Inside the climate bubble, this acute conflict is deadened. Might this also be the dead mother Mia is referring to? In my experience, children and young people are often much more in touch with climate reality than adults. They know they are the generation who will have to live in the world we older adults made for them, a world in which we allowed them so little entitlement. When Mia says, you call it eco-trauma, I call it knowing your mother's being killed in the next room, is she speaking of the same kind of deafness that the Black Lives Matter movement encounters with racism? The deafness that allows one group to leave all the suffering to another group. I believe neoliberalism's culture of uncare's most deadly appeal has been in its seductive promise that people can apparently dispense with all inner struggle. Who wants the pain and conflict of being alive? That position is now passé. Harold Searles, in a pioneering paper in 1972, foretold where this ultimately leads. Quote, in the pull upon us to become omnipotently free of human conflict, we are in danger of bringing about our extinction. The good life is culturally pre-configured as an Eden-like landscape, and to stay in Eden, we must avoid eating fruit from the tree of knowledge, which, if we remember, is essentially knowledge of right and wrong. Culture whips up a narrative that life outside Eden is too horrible to contemplate. But as Hannah Siegel pointed out, it is outside Eden that real life is lived, and where there are plenty of satisfactions alongside the tribulations. Not least, the satisfaction of feeling entitled to seek a relation with reality, which means facing real limits, including limits that come with the adoption of morality. Good leaders would make plain to us what these limits are and would help us live within them. The culture of uncare's seductive message in the background is that we can dispense with moral strife, but the reality is that to transition to a sustainable way of living, people do need to stay with the strife and to tread lightly on the earth. And that entails treating Earth as something loved and considering Earth in every single thing we do, from the food we choose, to our mode of travel, to how we relate to our groups about climate, to the choices about political actions we take to protect the Earth. This is what living outside of Eden now entails. We have come to believe we are entitled to be spared the hassle of caring. It is not that we are insensible to climate, plastic, or other environmental problems that our collective actions cause. It is that we treat the lively, reality-seeking part of the self as unimportant in our small daily moments of choice. We undermine its willpower. Climate wars are fought inside as well as outside us. And because the inner wars happen largely beneath our radar, we may not be sufficiently aware of this. The most treacherous fake promise offered by the dominant culture of uncare is return to the bubble and you can be spared all this inner discomfort. Hannah Siegel described the death drive as a wish to fall into the arms of a fantasy that the pain of living can be avoided. This is Freud's nirvana principle. And the danger is that if the fossil fuel age is not ended very soon now, and we don't start living within our means, reality will become ever more unbearable, and people may be increasingly be tempted to defend against too much psychic pain with the too little defense. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you for that really thought-provoking and essential.
I've just lost my picture. I'm sorry. I'm going to try and get it back. It's okay.
You're back. Good.
That's it. Lovely. Okay.
We've got about 40 minutes now before we are due to break. So there's time before Susanna's response. There's I'm sorry, can you hear me? Yes, sorry, I thought I'd been signed out for a moment. Before Susanna's response, there's time for us to have some sort of initial thoughts and reactions to what Sally has been provoking in us, I guess. I was thinking, just as you were talking about the tragic position, how that thought's a really useful one. The idea that if we think of sort of Aristotle's notion of tragedy, the error is a human error, the hamartia, an error that is sort of inbuilt, that doesn't come through vice or depravity, but comes because of an error that is the person is blind to, if you like, which perhaps gives more of a sense that we can forgive that part of ourselves, or can move towards forgiveness in that part of ourselves. That was a thought that came to me anyway. But if we can open the discussion to anybody really who would like to comment or question or just reflect on what we've heard.
Can you hear me, Susie?
Yes, we can, Susie. Thanks.
But I mean, I find it hard to speak or formulate because I feel upset. It's really part of what Sally's talking about. It's not a position to easily move to an overview or a knowing. I think one of the things I'm feeling is how awful it is to face irreparable harm, if you like. You know, I was thinking about a depressive position, so emphasises the idea of repair. But I think this area of the tragic is about something much harder, which is a notion of irreparable, which is quite hard to stick with. I don't feel that Sally's saying that's it, you know, something about working through something, but it's very difficult. You know? So I can feel whole part of me sort of retreating, wanting to go back to lightening, you know. There's something very important here, and it's felt, you know, and it's made itself felt through the screen, through our distance from each other, but that's all I can say for the moment.
Susie, thank you for what you've said, because you know, I was anticipating a silence after what I said. And it's hard to take it in, and it's, you know, it is very, very difficult, and I think you both of you picked up, you know, different aspects of the irreparable. linking it with the tragic position, the problem is that one can get paralyzed in guilt.
Yeah.
And I thought, you were saying, Tim, you were saying that you were finding another way through that can we actually approach the irreparable without becoming paralyzed with guilt? John Steiner wrote a really powerful paper. I don't know if who of you've read that paper, but it's on Oedipus at Colonus. And Oedipus is facing the irreparable. And it's actually when, at that moment, he sees the truth and he's able to see the truth. Then Jocasta commits suicide. Oedipus puts out his eyes and he ascends to arrogance and to omnipotence. And Steiner's discussing that kind of moment. And I think, he's got no one to forgive him at that moment. His mother's killed herself. And I think it is about irreparable damage and how we bear it. I also think it's a part of life. I mean, I think this is colossal what we're dealing with, but I think, perhaps we're acculturated to living in a bubble where we don't really have to face damage at all. Our world is fractured and split into very idealized pictures with all the damage hidden. I really think that this culture has messed with our minds, and that's why that was the photo I took at a demonstration. Quit playing games with my heart. I think this culture really messes with our minds. So that we do have some capacity to bear the irreparable, but it is a very difficult thing to bear without feeling crippled by guilt. Or seeking, as Steiner was arguing, seeking the omnipotent solution and ascending to manic fixes. Actually, Irma Brenman-Pick used this phrase, the tragic position, and I haven't really, I just want to mention that because I haven't had a proper discussion with her about quite what she meant by it. But, I want to have that discussion because I think, I might be very important to acknowledge her, and quite what she meant. But I think she said, perhaps we need a tragic position now, that the depressive position is not enough. And so this was what I made of that,
Hi, Sally. I wondered if there was something about how people can become very wrapped up in themselves. I'm thinking of another way of dealing with the wider crisis is to think, well, I've recycled that, or I've got some non-dairy milk and now I can sleep at night. And there's an individual trying to deal with it without thinking about the wider world.
Can you say more about that, or
Well, I guess I'm just trying to analyse how on earth I deal with it on a day-to-day basis, because my children are the same age or similar age to the young woman who was in the video, and it's pretty heartbreaking because you're just about to send these people out into the world. And it's a mess, and I find myself sometimes thinking, well, I'll do my bit, and just unable to think more than that particular. That's as far as I can get before despair kicks in, and I can just feel it just in the distance, not far off, really.
Can I add to that, Chris? I also feel this urge to withdraw, and it struck me, Sally, when you said you're glad Susie spoke, Tim had spoken, that while there needs to be room to think, perhaps this is a time when silence isn't helpful. When, as you said, we actually need to be able to bear something, and that is born better, and I think actually thought about better together. So not in a withdrawn silence, but in an attempt to talk and think and feel and perhaps lament together.
Sorry, go on.
I'd just like to say something quite simple.
Hi, Edie.
I have a lot of friends in San Francisco and Northern California, and they described the other week looking out the window and seeing orange sky and realizing they're breathing in smoke. And orange sky is just stuck with me. You know, I don't know what to call it, but it is almost unbearable. That's all I have to say.
Yeah. I think I wanted just to pick up. I mean, we're talking about the unbearable, and I don't want to move off that subject because, you know, I think it's very important to be discussing it together, actually. But I just wanted to say about, you know, what can one do in terms of individual. I think it very quickly gets into a sort of a binary, like, well, there's nothing I can do. It's all down to government, and if we were told to change and so on, I would go along with that. But as an individual, that, you know, it gets, and then also what you were raising, what does one do as an individual? And the one thing I would say is that I think that one needs to start with the actual facts. There's a very good book actually by Roe Randall called in Time, and Alan Brown, called In Time for Tomorrow, and it actually tells you all about carbon and what you're doing, because we have no framework. We're given no framework, you know, to be able to work out, you know, I mean, so for instance, in the US, a person is using 7 times more carbon than they should be. I think it's 4 times in this country as compared with Africa, for instance, or India, or large sections of the global south, you know. But I think we actually need information. So that's one issue. Another issue is that there's a huge discussion to be had about this, in my view, because I have found that whereas I absolutely believe this has got to be government-led, it's got to be a government-led thing or it's not going to work. Nonetheless, what has actually changed me is making individual changes. It's changed my consciousness. And what happens when you actually decide to do something that involves a bit of renunciation is that you face conflict, that it becomes alive in yourself, and it's not alive until you actually do that. So I actually think it's both. I think it's a question of trying to I find it a question of trying to free myself and my mind from heavy acculturation. You can't entirely free yourself from it, but I think it really is not an either or. Anyway, but I don't want to take away from this situation of the irreparable, because I think we are facing, we're in a very, very difficult moment. We're emerging from the climate bubble at a very, very difficult point.
I really liked your idea about the bubbles, Sally. I found that really helpful. And it makes me think about narcissism really, and which I thought is kind of fundamental to what you're saying. I don't think you used that word, and that makes me think about just what you've said now, really, about the sacrifices that have to be made, and just how difficult that is, and how wounding. And I don't know, it seems to be very much a challenge to a narcissistic culture and the narcissism in all of us, really. And it just makes me think about that, the bubbles.
I'm suddenly struck. It's something about Marianne, you using the word narcissism just suddenly made me think or elaborate on what I was thinking about just before, about the nature of the way in which this is irreducibly a systemic and social thing. It's that comment earlier that you made, Sally, about, social collaboration being the strongest antidote, in a sense. But I think we're really afraid too of, it's something about that tension between our individuality and our embeddedness in the social. As you say, Sally, the non-binary, really, and how, what is it that we fear gets lost in the individual, by remaining sensible to our individuality, whilst also how do we really take up the fact of being social in clusters and in a system in which there is hate as well as love.
I love your phrase, embeddedness in the social. And it reminds me of an experience that I had during lockdown. Because, I'll try and be brief about it, but I found myself, like a lot of people have described, feeling very anxious, that we're going to get the virus, and also much more alive, to nature, to wanting to reach out to people, and also to my own inner life. And I found it quite remarkable. And so I was sort of thinking about it and trying to process it. And to cut a long story short, there was a moment, I forget when actually, when the latest, not that long ago, the latest Extinction Rebellion protest started up again. We're all now eco-terrorists, by the way, anyone who's involved with, and I do criticize some of their tactics and so on, but basically I think it's extraordinary. Anyway, I was very surprised to find myself going on a local Extinction Rebellion event, because I'm also in a health risk group, so I'm very freaked out about, social distancing and all this. Anyway, I live in Muswell Hill in London, and the event was a die-in, where, a die-in is where people lie down on the pavement, and then for a time, and then they get up. This die-in was socially distanced. Everyone was wearing masks and so on. It was incredibly well organized. It was moving from one pedestrian crossing to another in Muswell Hill, and lying down on the edges of each of those pedestrian crossings for 4 minutes, causing traffic disruption. But the pedestrians could walk, through the middle of the pedestrian crossing. And then there were people kind of talking to the people in the cars, saying this is going to be for 4 minutes, and this is why, etc. It was very well managed. But as we got up, and we were instructed to get up from the first lie down, everybody chanted, "We want to live. Love, rage, rebel." And what astonished me was that this was exactly the point I had reached in my own personal deliberations. Of course, it's also at the time of the Black Lives Matter movement. We want to breathe, we want to live. And I suddenly realized that actually I wasn't alone at all. This was a group expression, I found it extraordinary, and I found so when you talk about being embedded in the social, we're not only embedded in a culture of uncare. We also struggle to be in a culture of care, and in a very different sort of culture, which doesn't atomize us. Actually, the culture of uncare seeks to atomize us, so that when we talk about being individuals, we also individualized and atomized. That's one of the things that this culture has done, because it doesn't like us to be powerful. That would conflict with commercial interests, quite honestly. It's a very cynical thing. But here we had, so I thought, well, that's it really. I didn't have to go through all that process. It was there. Captured everything. So, embedded in culture. But I think to tackle climate change, we need to unembed ourselves from neoliberal culture and embed ourselves in a different culture. And I think the feeling behind that is massive at the moment. The rage is massive, and it's a very dangerous point, because that could be turned, and it will be tried to be turned into something very destructive. But actually, I think it's very powerful and on the side of life. Sorry, it's a bit of a speech, but I think this is how I would approach the individual and the social. I think one of the things that is happening is that we're not thinking in binaries so much. We are in the social, and we are also individual, but depending on the culture that we're in, we will experience being individuals very differently. Yeah.
I'm not sure how this fits, but as I've been listening to the last few people who've been commenting, I suppose I've been really struck in my head with something I picked up when I was reading something that referred to Winnicott and the destructiveness of the infant sucking at the mother's breast, and which is something about consumption and the act of living, which is about consumption, which is about destruction. And that seems present in us and in the natural world where we all eat each other. And I guess, I'm not sure where it fits, but there's something for me in how difficult it is to face up and own my destructiveness, but that also is the destructiveness of the social groups that we try and belong to without feeling alienated from. And I don't quite know how it fits, but it's been really stuck with me, so I thought I'd sort of speak up.
I'm not well placed to make the comment I'm going to make, or the question really, because I'm not at all religious, and I don't, other people here, I think, probably are much better placed to talk about this than I am. But just thinking about the tragic position, I'm wondering whether or not it at all relates to something that to something religious or spiritual in some way. And what I mean by that, and like I say, I don't think I'm well placed to explore this particularly, but this actually, my impression is that for people who do have faith, and and some of the writings of the great religions of the world, there is an idea of something that is not just bigger than the individual, but also bigger than the social group, that extends to the earth and, if you like, all the creatures within it and all the sort of systems, really, that allow the earth to be a living organism and alive in some sort of a way. And I'm just sort of, I've been sort of thinking about the depressive position and thinking that, as far as I know, a lot of writing about the depressed position doesn't really extend beyond the individual and the social into this sort of third dimension, one might say. And I'm just wondering whether the tragic position in some way relates to that area of spirituality and religion at its best, clearly.
that makes me think of the poem. The love in the poem for nature, and actually how it comes to a head with that image of mother being killed in the room in the next door, and what a contrast it is to what John Steiner writes about, where the mother's killed herself. So I do take the point about religion, something that's about love. I don't know, I wouldn't be qualified to talk about religion either. But something about how much you're connected or how much you love the place you live in, which is, I think, what Sally comments on straight after the poem, that this young girl is so connected and so she loves the natural world that she lives in. So that resonates for me. What Simon said just resonates for me.
I think that one of the things our current culture does is it removes us from any sense of an external world, a natural world, a world that sustains us and feeds us. I also think that psychoanalytic theory does the same thing, and it's not necessary. We are embedded in culture. We are also embedded in nature. We're multiply rooted and embedded, and too often, and it's not really necessary, psychoanalytic theory will strip out nature. Take it as a metaphor. If someone comes and says, I'm very, very upset by what's happening in the world, the parody of the psychoanalyst, but it's too often true, is that will be taken as representing an object relationship, a human-object relationship, and it will be explored as such. And it's really not necessary. And one of the things I'm excited about is that members of this new IPA climate committee, we're submitting papers for the Vancouver conference, which is on the infantile, actually bringing clinical material which concerns nature, and how actually that nature itself is an internal object. We internalize nature, and we're embedded in nature. So I think that that happened to many people with lockdown. Suddenly, whoa, nature was there. The shock of a shock like COVID actually put people back in touch with what's really important, and it was not only their relationships with other people, it was nature. Right there, so that's one issue. And I think it relates to the previous person who spoke. Was that Simon? How do we reconnect, whether one's religious or not? I'm not religious. I don't feel the need to be religious to connect with the awe of nature or my love of nature. It's profound, and I think it is a question of embedding and re-embedding, and it's a psychic act of, so we need another decentering from thinking that we're the center of the world. We need to reposition ourselves as being in the world. We've never quite accepted being in the world and what that actually means psychically for us. So I think I find these things not so much difficult as very exciting and opening up of new ways of seeing, and sorry, can I just bang on a bit more? The thing about Winnicott and greed is taken as being something, we think of it as bad. I don't see it as bad. I see it as part of life, you get your teeth into something. And if you haven't got a bit of greed, you haven't got any gusto, you're not alive. I think the thing is, when greed meets a constraint, a limit, the trouble is that our culture has boosted on that's where omnipotence comes in, because omnipotent quick fixes are to bypass that moment where greed hits the wall and this is how much there is no more, this is it. Okay, and it somehow then has a quick fix where that's not true apparently, and then you're in a fake universe, and then you're in a very, very dangerous universe. And that's what's happened to us on a mass scale. So I don't think there's anything wrong with greed or destructiveness or breaking down, or digesting, or it's just that it's been so very deformed, I think.
For me, that links back to Lucy's pointing to breastfeeding. And I've always thought, it's absolutely right and just, as it were. It's perfectly natural that the infant goes at the milk fiercely because it is a matter of survival. It's a matter of food. But then I've always felt that breastfeeding, the milk goes in 10 minutes, as it were. Yeah. But the remainder of the breastfeeding is sensuous skin to skin. Mm. It's an encounter. It's an exchange of love and engagement. And that's a different kind of exploration from the limit of the milk's finishing, potentially at its best.
There's a wonderful South American Amerindian writer and leader at the moment. He's writing on climate. He knocked my socks off, actually. And he talks about, the Western gaze, and that we're caught up in what he calls a drool. And he uses analytic theory. It's like we lifted our head like infants from the breast, and we looked around and we thought, oh my God, everything's coming to an end. And we're in a moment of drool, and what we want to do is clamp ourselves back onto the breast and not appreciate that actually not everything is coming to an end. This is a moment, it's a moment of maturation, and I think that this also, when we talk about the tragic position, I think that we can get caught up in that description of Krynex. It's like, this is a catastrophe. We've lost our idealized world. There is no other world. If you talk to, and we can experience a kind of fake tragedy actually as well, which takes us away from, that's the doom and gloom, it's apocalyptic. And if you talk to young people, they are not, they're much less idealizing than we are. They know that the world is damaged. They also know it's the only one they've got, and they want to stop the damage, and they're out on the streets. So, I think the whole issue of the tragedy and the irreparable, everything can become black and white and can be used defensively to not make the changes that we could actually make.
I suppose I had some thoughts about the tragedy and the tragic as a kind of aesthetic category. Because one way of thinking about the tragedy is it's a kind of contradiction between subjective desires and objective forces that are stronger than those desires. And one thing you need in a tragedy is a hero, the tragic hero who is a victim of those objective forces that are bigger than him. So I was just thinking about kind of omnipotence and the fantasy of omnipotence, and who is the tragic hero in the tragic position, and what are the objective forces that will destroy them, and how can that destruction be a kind of cleansing process or a renewal or a process of maturation, as you suggest?
I think that I take from what you're saying that this idea of the tragic position needs a lot of working through, because, as you rightly say, in theatre tragedy, there is an unfolding drama that the hero is not in charge of. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about the application of the kind of tragic position that I'm outlining, or and hopefully we can help to outline it together here. It raises issues. I mean, the tragic for me is not an aesthetic or form. It is that heart-wrenching sense of I can't make it better. I can't fix it. And we all know that in our lives. This is not an abstraction. I believe, who here has not had life experiences where, we've been part of real damage in our relationships or whatever it is, and we know a bit of what that feels like. It's horrible, it's really, very hard to work through. Because with the tragic position, it's usually those that we love that we have damaged in our relationships and so on, So I'm taking it more from that point of view, but I take what you say about, situating it and taking the word tragedy seriously.
I don't know if anyone else has seen one of the recent blockbusters at the cinema, but it did put me in mind of envy as a issue. If I can't have it, no one can. And particularly when I see people like Donald Trump, who he's had quite a lot of life and quite a lot of living, and it's as if he's doesn't want his children or his grandchildren to have the same. It's I'm losing something, so I'm going to take it with me. That sort of envious destruction seems part of this.
Huh. Any thoughts about that? Anyone?
I guess it's the thought that is in my mind is that I almost go back to infancy, and there's something about how difficult it is for us to share resources with other people, with other species, and if there's some maturational difficulty that we're having.
It's got to be profoundly important, this idea of sharing, actually. I mean, in this book that I've just got coming out, somebody said we're talking about narcissism, and yes, we are, but in the book, I identify one aspect of narcissism, and we've all got it, and it's being an exception, because the book is about exceptionalism. And being an exception, I mean, Freud wrote about it, it's that, anyway, I elaborate being an exception. And one of its features, it's a form of entitlement, which I spell out as entitlement to self-idealize, to have whatever you want, and also to be spared and to use omnipotent thinking so that you don't have to suffer the impossibility of that position. It's that cluster, and we've all got it, and the entitled person, if it's severe, they don't see any need to share. It either can be individual or the group. It's for us. There is no sharing. We all have this. I think if we're going to get anywhere, with these problems, we're going to have to be a lot more realistic about the destructive forces within us, and envy is another one. But envy itself is a consequence of idealizing the self, because if you feel that you're entitled to it all, if you see anybody else with any of it, it's enraging. You're the one who's worth it, they're not worth it. Maybe humans don't really want to live with where they've fetched up, which is unless they take their destructiveness and their dark desires seriously, and constantly own it as part of themselves, they're not going to get anywhere. They're not going to solve this problem. Because only when they do take that seriously do they then realize that they actually have to have frameworks of care in place. They've got to have, things that constrain power. They've got to actually, help people to contain their anxieties. And what we've got at the moment is a Donald Trump who's doing the complete reverse. He's doing everything to smash containment, But, to have a mind is to own the conflict inside yourself and in the group and pay it great attention in an ongoing way. In psychoanalytic terms, that's the depressive position. It's not something that you arrive at one day and then it's all over. It's something that is reworked and that you come to understand that that is the nature of the kind of animal that you are, that it has to be reworked. Now, we seem to have reached a point where we don't want any of this. Oh, that's one side of us anyway.
I was thinking that's the whole predicament of how the unbearableness of bearing your own destructiveness, the pain of it, and how difficult it is.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a good point for us to break.
Sounds good. Yeah.
Thank you, Sally. And
coffee helps.
Yeah. Thank you, Sally, and thank you to everyone. And maybe if we take 15 minutes and come back at 11:45, where we can hear Susanna's response to the paper. See you in 15 minutes.